Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles, a podcast that takes serious history and makes it a little bit more fun. My name is Keith Hocton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster, and I love most, if not all, things historical. Today's topic is Mr. Cecil Rhodes. Yes, that's Mr. Rhodes of the Rhodes Scholarship fame. Let's step into the world of Cecil Rhodes, a British dynamo who blazed a trail across Africa in the late 19th century. Imagine a time when his name resonated through the rumble of diamond mines and the vast savannas of that continent. Rhodes was no ordinary fellow. He founded the De Beers Diamond Company and held the keys to the global diamond kingdom, one of, if not the first ever gem tycoons that the world had ever seen. But here's where the tale takes a twist. Our ambitious protagonist didn't just stop at diamonds. Oh no. He expanded the British Empire's map like a pro, christening new lands with his moniker. Picture it. Zambia and Zimbabwe, once Rhodesia, danced to the rhythm of his vision. But be warned, his legacy isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Fast forward to today, and the controversy surrounding Rhodes resembles a high-stakes drama. At Oxford's Oriel College, there's a statue, a hot potato sparking debates about history, oppression, and symbols. Some argue it's a living testament, others label it as an offensive relic. Are we erasing history or building a more inclusive future? It's like a debate between tradition and progress, but with all the added drama. Let's talk about the Rhodes Scholarship, the product of his wealth. It's like a Hogwarts letter for brilliant minds, whisking them off to Oxford. The scholarship's Cinderella story is a twist. Rhodes's imperial dreams gave way to a diverse global stage that champions thinkers from all corners. Imagine Rhodes shaking hands with an LGBTQ+ advocate. That's the scholarship's evolution. But hold on to your seats. Rhodes wasn't your average explorer. He had a vision, a sort of Brits are best outlook vision. His exploits disrupted indigenous societies and threw them into a whirlwind of change. Rhodes was like a wild card, driven by a mix of British pride and incredibly lofty ideals. Fast forward again, and today's debate echoes in the streets. Rhodes is just no longer a name. He's a symbol of elitism and a past riddled with oppression. But the guy wasn't all bad. He shaped Southern Africa's history like a puzzle master, a combination of accomplishments and controversies. Rhodes isn't just a chapter in the history book. He's actually a legend that's been etched in time. I grew up reading Wilbur Smith novels, and most of those novels were set in Southern Africa, certainly the early ones. And the first book of his that I read, When the Lion Feeds, references Cecil Rhodes for the first time. And in fact, it was the first time that I'd ever heard of him. Wilbur Smith himself was born in Ndola in what was then Northern Rhodesia, which is now, of course, Zambia. Wilbur Smith's stories opened a new world to me, and opened to me the Africa that, as an 11-year-old boy, I could only dream of visiting. And of course, through those historical novels, I came to know a little bit more about Mr. Cecil Rhodes. Sadly, Rhodes is never out of the news these days, and for all the wrong reasons. He was a British businessman, a prospector, and a politician who took up residence in South Africa and was then a keen imperialist, pushing the boundaries of British Southern Africa even further north, lending his name to the country that became Rhodesia. That area is now known as Zambia and Zimbabwe. The controversy about Rhodes these days is all about his statue at Oriel College, Oxford. And it is a contentious one. Yes, Cecil Rhodes was indeed a complicated figure. He pursued his ambitions with ruthless determination and was known for his aggressive business tactics. His statue, however? Some see the statue as different from the Rhodes Scholarship, as the statue is largely a recognition of an individual with his imperialistic actions and reactionary views, as well as his legacy, while the scholarship is an evolving and contemporary legacy that is about its contribution to people and society today. I actually find the two very hard to dismiss, I'll be honest with you. The idea that taking down the statue is denying history or the legacy left by Rhodes might not be true. There are plenty of examples of imperialist history at Oxford, but removing some of the symbols of elitism could actually help promote pluralism. Just a thought. However, a statue is not a cautionary tale that teaches about previous supremacist views, and it does not tell the difficult story of colonialism. The argument goes that by its very nature, a statue intends to glorify the man and his actions. Unlike collections and books, statues are not nuanced and do not provide a means of studying or adding black voices to the understanding of history. The culture in Oxford is still elitist. Of that, there is no contention. And you could also argue makes most people of colour and people from non-elite classes extremely uncomfortable. Removing the Rhodes statue is one of many things that could make Oxford more accessible to people of colour. Of that, there is no question. Personally, I'd like elite education to be available to the best and the brightest young people, not just those who have either been desensitized to or celebrate the evidence of symbols of oppression that still feature in everyday life. As we can all see in the events of the past months and years, young black people experience many entrenched structural disadvantages. Therefore, encouraging young black people not to take up an educational opportunity just because it is in the name of a known imperialist is counterproductive. Even considering this option demonstrates enormous privilege. The Rhodes Scholarship carries enormous prestige, which has now little to do with the original founder. Rhodes certainly wasn't a slave trader, but he was an imperialist and a businessman who capitalized on the global structural exploitation of colonized people. But he wasn't the first to do so. And in fairness, he was very much a white man of his times. His aims are certainly not supported by the Rhodes Scholarship and the Rhodes Trust. I believe the scholarship exists well in the modern world and has actually moved away from its imperialistic, sexist, and racist associations and origins. Now the scholarship takes women, and not just men, from many different backgrounds and ethnicities, and it is valued for its broader associations with great thinkers of various nationalities and ethnicities. This is very important. Keep in mind also that women were not allowed to vote in the United Kingdom until 1928. And what I'm pointing to is when the Rhodes Scholarship came into being, it was a very different time. While it is moving ahead, I do think the Rhodes Trust could do more to acknowledge and further these changes. The great Nelson Mandela partnered with the Rhodes Trust in 2003, in its 100th year, to create a Rhodes Mandela Scholarship in South Africa with a mission to build exceptional leadership capacity by empowering young Africans who aspire to the kind of leadership that Mandela embodied. You would also argue Cecil Rhodes. This has been supported by many large donations from a variety of sources, as has the Rhodes Trust in general. I think more structured and renamed scholarships such as this could be set up by the Rhodes trustee. Something for them to think about. Look, it's certainly a longer topic for discussion, but I'll finish by saying that more than 7,000 people have actually benefited from the scholarship since its inception in 1903. They include Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott and former President of the United States, Bill Clinton. Other notables include Rachel Maddow, Naomi Wolf, Edwin Hubble of the telescope fame, David Pretorius, and, of course, the amazing David Suzuki. Without Rhodes, there would be no scholarship, and the world, I think, would be a very, very different place. So who was this controversial figure that I remember from my childhood Wilbur Smith days? Personally, I don't think there could be a better time to be talking about Cecil Rhodes. But have we built this man into mythical proportions? I don't think so. This one individual was hugely important in the history and the development of South Africa, which has led to South Africa being a leading country in the world today. And if you look at the true record and the historiography of Rhodes and his last 15 years in the foundation of Rhodesia that led to a fundamental transition and shift from, if you like, long-standing millennial feudalism to modernity that actually took 90 years and continues, he was definitely a man of the late Victorian era, and he died in 1902, 1 year after Queen Victoria. In September 1890, Cecil Rhodes' pioneer column trundled into Mashonaland to establish Fort Salisbury and the new colonial state named after its founder, Rhodesia. Mashonaland is now a region of northern Zimbabwe, and it's home to nearly half of the population of Zimbabwe. However, keep in mind that Rhodes was conquering a land that had been taken from the Khoisan people by the people of the Shona, a people believed to have lived in this area for 150,000 years. These Khoisan had been pushed out of the high veld by incomers from the north, the Shona, and ultimately there were 7 of these lords of the savannah that came and went and created mini-empires over time. And if you look at the long arch of history in this area, Rhodes and the country that he created, Rhodesia, he was just another conqueror. And Rhodes fell as well. And now we have a new Lord of the Savannah in his place. So where to start? One would think that Cecil Rhodes would be a tough physical man, as he made his fortune in diamond mining and gold, a tough industry now, never mind then. But he actually wasn't. He was, however, supremely intelligent, and he had a drive like few others. He had a very rural British upbringing, and the reality is that he was somewhat sickly. Wilbur Smith hints at him being gay, as do a number of other historians, and if truth be told, Rhodes himself never publicly declared his sexual orientation. When you study the man, I think Smith is being disingenuous, and that Rhodes had numerous admirable qualities. The question of his sexuality? I don't think that matters one iota. However, when Rhodes was just 16 years of age, his family's medical advisors advised in Bishop Stortford, which is where he was from, that he go out and join his brother Herbert in Port Natal, a colony then in the British Empire. Rhodes actually had his 17th birthday on the ship alone. Keep in mind, guys, this was a 70-day voyage, and when he arrived, there was no one there to meet him. It's actually hard to imagine a 17-year-old doing anything like that now, never mind then, but that also tells you of how strong of mind he actually was. In the 1860s, Southern Africa was a region characterized by its diverse and often tumultuous landscape, encompassing a range of cultures, people, and interactions. The area was home to various indigenous groups such as the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sotho, the San, each with their own distinct languages, traditions, and social structures. These societies were deeply rooted in subsistence agriculture, cattle herding, and hunting-gathering practices, and their interactions were shaped by an intricate network of trade, warfare, and diplomacy. And all of this was going on well before the white settlers arrived. The arrival of European colonial powers, mainly the British and the Dutch settlers, known as Boers or Afrikaners, actually had a profound effect upon the region during this period. The expansion of European influence led to conflicts between these colonial powers, the indigenous groups, and later Indian and Chinese laborers who were brought to work in the mines and the plantations. This was a complex land indeed. The discovery of valuable resources like diamonds and gold further intensified European interest, resulting in the disruption of traditional ways of life and the imposition of colonial governance systems. These dynamics set the change for the complex socio-political landscapes that would continue to evolve throughout the 19th century and beyond in southern Africa. This was the country that a very young Cecil Rhodes arrived in. As soon as he arrived, he departed to the Omkamas Valley to grow cotton with his brother. When Herbert would take time off to travel to the gold and then the diamond fields looking for opportunities to substitute their incomes, Cecil himself at the age of 17 was left managing a workforce of some 30-odd Zulus. And I think what's important to note here, given the controversy of Rhodes and his statue and Rhodes the man, is that Africans actually preferred to work with Rhodes. Even as a young man, he was known to be a better employer. Cecil worked the Cotton Valley for about a year and a half before he decided to take off on a trek by himself with one Zulu tracker as a companion. And I think that's very interesting because in a lot of the Wilbur Smith books, the main characters in the Smith books are usually, if not always, accompanied by a single Zulu tracker. And obviously now you can see where Wilbur Smith is actually getting that idea from. It took Rhodes 3 months to get to the Kimberley over very rugged and dangerous territory, where the diamond mines were actually to be found. And actually on that note, folks, I can't but highly recommend Wilbur Smith's books that starts off talking about the Courtney family with When the Lion Feeds. And Smith is a master storyteller, and he follows this family through maybe 200 years worth of their progression from when they arrived to when South Africa is actually formed, and Rhodes and all of these other amazing characters that I'll talk about a little bit later on actually come into the story. So if you haven't read Wilbur Smith, then I would urge you to do so, because it's a fantastic insight into a land that very few people know very little about. Rhodes started off as a simple digger, and through years of digging, he managed to slowly accumulate various claims. Effectively, as diggers gave up and left, usually broke or disillusioned or dead, he would buy their claims, always believing in his quest. And as he amalgamated the holdings of these various claims over the years, he became one of the biggest diamond claim owners in the Kimberley. A very powerful man, and this is where he made his first fortune. His second fortune came with the discovery of gold in Witwatersrand, and these two polarities were the foundation of his fortunes. Cecil Rhodes was a workhorse. He worked long hours over many years, and he dealt with some of the toughest of the people in the world at Kimberley, both mentally and physically, and he had a very abrupt early education to the rural farming world when he first arrived in the Unkemas Valley, which was an area of low distinction at the time for growing cotton crops. As a young man in his early 20s, he succeeded where many had tried and failed and died. Yes, he made a lot of money, and very early on he took himself off to Oxford, a dream of his, and over a period of 7 years he journeyed from the mines to the Cape to Southampton and to Oxford and back again to study 14 times before finally earning his degree. So he was a self-made man in every sense of the word. He became a millionaire of the times and established a significant fortune, but his was nowhere near the great fortunes that ultimately were made by others such as Barney Benito and Alfred Bites, and others of the same time, with whom Rhodes was, of course, great friends. He left millions in his will and last testament to the Rhodes Scholarship, but he had also invested an enormous amount in the foundation of infrastructure in Rhodesia and the pioneers and the settlements. And he had made a lot of gifts and bequests to the government of the day and to various ethnicities, including the Imtabeli, whom he went to war with, and whose Indunas, the chiefs if you like, he had negotiated peace with in 1896 after the rebellion. So he actually put a lot on the table. He didn't live in the style into which he could have been accustomed. He led a very simplistic life, and he was often on horseback or on trek in small boats, in carts and wagons, exploring the countryside. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Altadomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. He eventually arrived in Mashonaland to try to get to the west and the southwest through Mklitsi, which was unfortunately swamped out. And then, of course, they had the worst torrential rains in years that ultimately blocked his entry. It's Murphy's Law. And this was never going to be easy on horseback in 1890. I mean, it was a literal washout, but Rhodes wasn't one to give up. So his next occasion was the following year through Beira, which was then a Portuguese holding in East Africa, up through the Pongri River, over the flatlands and the low veldt, which was infested with tsetse fly and fever-infested areas, into what was then the small village of Mtali. Rhodes was like a man possessed, and he tore through the country with an energy like a man possessed. He had a lot to do, and he felt that his time was slipping away. Personally, I think that he actually knew inherently that he wasn't going to live a long life. I've met individuals like that. I've known people that lived fast and lived very hard, and ultimately they died young. And I think if you're of that personality, you just know. And of course, then there was the ill-fated Jameson raid in 1895, which was a seminal moment in his life, and not a good one. The Jameson raid of 1895 was a failed military incursion led by Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, a British colonial statesman, into the South African Republic, known then as the Transvaal. The raid was an attempt to overthrow the government of the South African Republic and initiate an uprising by British settlers in the region. At the time, tensions were high between the British colonial authorities and the South African Republic, which was an independent Boer republic. The British settlers in the Transvaal, who were dissatisfied with the political and economic conditions, had hoped for British intervention, or at very least a British takeover in the region. In December 1895, Jameson, with the support and encouragement of Rhodes, launched the raid with a force of about 500 men. The plan was for the raiders to create a diversion and incite an uprising of British settlers, which would then be supported by a larger British force. However, the raid was a military and political disaster. The Transvaal authorities were aware of the raiders' plans and were able to intercept them. Jameson and his men were quickly surrounded and forced to surrender. The raiders were then taken as prisoners and then handed back to the British authorities. The Jameson raid had significant consequences, however. It increased tensions between the British Empire and the Boer republics and heightened the possibility of armed conflict. This then led to Rhodes's downfall as the Cape Premier. From that time, he devoted his entire commitment to Rhodesia. So he goes from being this self-made man in the diamond mines. Keep in mind, he helps form the De Beers Diamond Company, which is still a tour de force today in the diamond industry. He makes a second fortune in the gold fields, but how and why does he become an empire builder, an imperialist expanding the former British Empire in South Africa? There's no question that Rhodes absolutely wanted to establish Rhodesia as a self-governing colony, which it actually became in 1923, just after the British South Africa Company's charter had expired, which they had received from Queen Victoria. He was an incredibly complex man with many facets. His critics have argued that he wasn't an intellectual, but I disagree. He also had a library in his house in Cape Town that was probably the best of any in Africa, and probably one of the greatest ones in the world regarding Africana literature of the day. It has 2,500 books in it, and I think it was an inspiration to him. And you can actually tell a lot about a person by the books that they read and they collect or that they have in their homes. And he was clearly passionate about, and I would actually add, in love with Africa. He always took his books on his travels, and interestingly, he had agents scouring Europe for any literature on Africa, which continued all the way through his life. So should we think about Rhodes and the establishment of Rhodesia, which was just to the north of Britain's colonial colonies in South Africa, as almost like the East India Company setting up in Bengal 150 years earlier? Was Rhodes's empire a private enterprise empire like the British East India Company? Not really. It was certainly under a royal charter, just like the British East India Company, which had also been given a charter by Queen Elizabeth I. Rhodes was given by Queen Victoria, and his company had been given a 25-year tenure. And it basically required that Rhodes established a civil government. Of course, the natural institutions that were founded there were completely different to anything that had been there before. And the terrain was actually called Zambezia, which was really a set of, Ndebele dynasties and a whole number of smaller, shallow patriarchs of limited scale and significance who had actually been colonized by the Ndebele and enslaved by them for the past 53 years. As well as slavery by the Ndebele, the Portuguese had also penetrated Mashonaland, and they were also taking slaves. So what Rhodes effectively walked into and created was a very different model to others that had been set up in Southern and East Africa by other colonial states at that time. So Rhodes was effectively going in and meeting with the chiefs, something that had never been done before, and was getting mineral concessions from them. But was he actually exploiting them? Did he want to eventually supplant them and rule directly? Or did he also want to flood settlers into the area on the ground and amalgamate the two? Another important question is, how did he think that his relationship with the Shona and these other groups would actually work? Well, in the initial concession, called the Rudd Concession of 1888, also known as the Mineral Concession, This agreement was signed between the British businessman Charles Rudd and King Lobengula of the Ndebele Kingdom, now part of present-day Zimbabwe. The concession granted exclusive mining rights to the British South Africa Company, BSAC, in the territory that was controlled by King Lobengula. This also included Mashonaland in present-day Zimbabwe and Mozambique. The agreement gave the British South Africa Company exclusive rights to search for mineral resources, particularly gold and other valuable minerals within the designated territory. But also keep in mind that there were no clear boundaries in those days, and this concession was, of course, to prospect for minerals and to establish settlements. Keep in mind also that King Lobengula controlled this area and had about 20,000 hardened warriors to call on if he was needed, if he felt the concession was being undermined or if he was being taken advantage of. Lastly, keep in mind also that King Lobengula willingly signed this agreement with Rhodes. Interestingly, he later said that Rhodes had tricked him into it. But he was also facing an invasion from the Boers to the east, and there were lots of independent adventurers prospecting in his territory as well, and a mini invasion from the British from the south. And he was playing, I think, a very careful game. My suspicion is that he willingly agreed to let Rhodes prospect in the hope that Rhodes would be a willing friend in times of need. I mean, that being the case, it was a very smart and a very political move. This very quickly went sideways when Lobengula conducted a number of raids into Mashonaland to take slaves, and his warriors walked into British settlements where the Shona were working and literally started slaughtering them in front of the settlers. In response to this massacre, Rhodes and Jameson had to act, and it was a bloody confrontation that the settlers won. However, this was no second Rand, no second Kimberley, and the initial expectations and hopes of the settlers to find gold and diamonds were dashed, and they had to survive. The settlers ended up turning towards agriculture and land as an agrarian economy was built up initially, and subsequently investment in the form of mining. But it was not the old-style mining of the ancients that had been there for 1,500 years before. They were rather shallow mines and then surface and alluvial mining, but it was a full-on mining enterprise. And it wasn't restricted to gold either. It went into a range of minerals, which included chrome. So, what did Rhodes think of these African societies that he encountered? Initially, I would have thought, and I've read most of his speeches and his literature, and he was clear from that point of view that the British were the best nations, if you like, for Africa's feudalism. He was absolutely opposed to the behavioral characteristics and the predation of the Ndebele that would enslave the Shona and the other tribes in the area. But if you read into his speeches and you listen to what he's saying, his intention was to have one type of society with a meteocratic system. There were certainly ideas for qualifications to vote, and they were clearly not in likelihood to be met by very many of the native societies that were around at that particular time. Basically, the local societies would have to be brought on progressively over time, and this is, in effect, the economics of what actually happened. Another common question about Rhodes is, did he start the Boer War? Was it his fault? And was that and is that a disaster that tarnishes his legacy? The simple answer to that is no. That's a claim made in several biographies, but I don't believe it. And don't forget that he had to resign as Premier of the Cape Colony in 1896, immediately in 96, after the failure of the Jameson raid. The Boer War, I think, was a confrontation between London and Pretoria, between the Afrikaners, or the Boer as they were called, and Kruger on the one hand, and Milner in the south as Premier of the Cape on the other. This was a war fought between the British Empire and two Boer republics, the South African Republic, Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, from 1899 to 1902. And I think what's clear here is that it was a land grab, or an attempted land grab by the British. They were after the gold and the diamonds. It's as simple as that. However, The underlying causes of the war were actually very complex and rooted in tensions between the settlers, descendants of the Dutch and the Huguenot colonists, and the British colonial authorities. Going back to what I just said, the discovery of gold and diamonds in the Boer republics actually intensified these tensions as it attracted a large influx of British miners and entrepreneurs. Effectively, the British wanted what the Boers had, and they went to war over it. The British government issued an ultimatum to the Boer governments demanding political reforms and equal rights for British immigrants, which they knew the Boers would never agree to. And of course, when the Boers refused, the conflict erupted. This was a horrible war that was characterized by guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Boer forces, quite clever, which initially caught the British off guard. However, the British Empire ultimately deployed a significant military force and employed tactics such as blockhouses. It pains me to say it, but concentration camps, because they were so horrendous, and scorched earth policies where they burnt the farms of the Boers to the ground in order to defeat the Boers. The conflict resulted in significant loss of life on both sides, unnecessary loss of life on both sides, with many civilian casualties due to the harsh conditions in the concentration camps. The Boer republics were ultimately defeated, and the territories were incorporated into the British Empire, which later laid the groundwork for the Union of South Africa in 1910. Disturbingly, the Boer War had lasting effects on South Africa and its people even to this day. It contributed to the growth of Afrikaner nationalism and influenced future events such as the struggle for independence, I would argue the policy of apartheid, and the eventual establishment of a democratic South Africa. So going back to how we originally started on this podcast with the Rhodes statue must fall factors, and Rhodes representing imperialism and racism, the exclusion of native peoples from their own sovereignty, running themselves, and some sovereignty in the part of Africa which he operated, the question begs, how should we remember Cecil Rhodes today? I think his intention was to have a self-governing colony or country. And when you think about it, it's as simple and yet as complicated as that. In the end, Rhodes was inspired by an ideal, and it was an ideal that he devoted himself to fully, and he served that idea rather than serve himself. And the ideal was imperial, but it's important to remember that to him and to many others at the time, the British Empire represented the best hope for the world. He truly believed that. And in the same way that many now are devoted to international agencies or aid agencies of human rights, the same kind of idealism went for Rhodes. And notwithstanding his mistakes and the flaws in his character, that's what drove him, and that's what we should remember him by. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed this chat. I hope it's thrown a little bit more light on Cecil Rhodes. It's an argument and a discussion I'm sure that will continue for many years to come. And if I can ask, please rate the show on whatever platform you listen to it on. And if you can, give it a 5-star rating, which of course will rocket it up the charts and more people will listen. Well, that's the hope, I suppose. If you could do that, I would be eternally grateful. After all, the show is free and it only takes a few minutes of your time. So thank you very much, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye for now.